Yay, it worked.
All right, here we are. So welcome to Godzilla Redacted. My name's Kyle Byrd. I am the co-host of the Kaiju Transmissions Podcast and co-founder of the Kaiju Masterclass online convention and YouTube channel. This is Steve Ryfle.
Yes, I'm still fumbling with stuff, but my name is Steve Ryfle, and I'm a writer that's been covering this genre for a number of years, and I'm also one of the co-creators of Kaiju Masterclass. So thank you all for coming and being interested in this subject matter. I think it's really fascinating. I hope you enjoy it.
So what we're going to do today is discuss military assistance and cooperation and see how military oversight influences and changes some of our favorite movies. To start, we're going to talk a little bit about the military entertainment complex in Hollywood. Most of this conversation is going to be around the American and Japanese films. We're going to start with Hollywood. For those who don't know, ever since World War II, Hollywood and the military complex have had a very close working relationship. It was decided after World War II. Hollywood could basically become an unofficial propaganda arm of the military. Now, one of the things that got me and Steve really interested in this is this documentary, Theaters of War, which is streaming on Canopy if you have a library card and some other services, and it really dives deep into this. And we first found out about that documentary when they leaked government script notes on the 2014 Godzilla, and we thought that was really interesting, and that just sent us through an insane rabbit hole that is almost never ending. Now, what does military assistance mean on a production? It means the Department of Defense has control over the script. They can mandate script changes. Now, you might be asking, why do productions cooperate with the military complex? And it's because if you have that partnership, the military will do things. They'll provide vehicles, personnel, extras, planes, helicopters, tanks. This saves movies a lot of money, like millions and millions of dollars. And so, if you have that assistance, you can have really cool stuff on the screen, really without eating into the budget a whole lot. So it happens a lot. They've had involvement in over 25,000 films and TV shows. 2,500.
You added a zero.
Their focus is on authenticity and detail, making sure things are portrayed right, but it's also there to promote public understanding and recruitment. I have a quote pulled from the documents about Lone Survivor, the Peter Berg film with Mark Wahlberg, and I'll just read it. It says, entertainment feature films, this is from their notes, that they gave the studio. It says, entertainment feature films like this reach far greater audiences than any single news media story about the actual events. Audiences going to see the film will voluntarily sit through a 2-hour infomercial about the participation of the Army Special Forces in one of our many joint missions.
If I can just interject one thing, though, before we get too deep. I think, playing devil's advocate, we might ask the question, what's the problem here? Why shouldn't the Pentagon, or why wouldn't the Pentagon be interested in maintaining a level of authenticity when the military is portrayed on screen? What's the issue? Why would someone make a 2-hour documentary and pull thousands of documents from the government to investigate why this is happening or what the effect of it is? And really, what's interesting here, I think, is that the film industry, in large part, has had to accept this Faustian bargain in order to obtain the cooperation and to have access to military equipment and personnel and to make their films look really awesome. They've had to accept a level of pretty precise control over screenplays to a large degree, and many productions have had to be substantially, as we'll see in a few minutes, substantially changed, and it has the effect in some cases of rewriting historical events and the way that they're portrayed on screen, to the effect of sometimes whitewashing, you might say, events involving the military. So go forward.
So some famous examples are Top Gun, the old one and the new one, which at the time was very heavily financed and under military influence to get interest in the recent Top Gun program. And these are things that are verified in the documents from the DoD, used to really try and change the public's perception of the military after Vietnam, and it worked. Transformers is probably the most famous example of a franchise. It's the only franchise to date that has had all 4 branches of the military overseeing it. Black Hawk Down is kind of an example of what Steve was saying. You know, it's about U.S. involvement in Somalia, which at the time was a really public embarrassment, and but that movie was made partially to shine a more heroic light on the events. And then Iron Man, that one is an example of how, you can still be a little bit critical, but that script went through a lot of changes. Tony Stark was not really involved in his father's industry as much. And we see in the film he midway has that turn, but it's a lot about how they make the military look, and we'll get into some of those things here.
The Tony Stark character's attitude toward the military-industrial complex completely changed.
Changes between script drafts.
It's really fascinating.
What causes them to deny a production? That's what their lingo is, their buzzword for it is what's called showstoppers. So examples are losing wars, military losing control of nukes, which we'll get to later, failure to prevent terrorism, abuse in the ranks, soldiers struggling to readjust into society after service, military incompetence and unheroic military death, the U.S. engaging in war crimes, illegal arms sales, drug trafficking, unjustified torture, institutional racism, soldier suicide, sexual assault, death by friendly fire, and
none of these things happen in the military.
Yeah, right.
So why should they, lie about that?
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of war films, like almost any movie about the Vietnam War, it gets turned down. The movie Jarhead, which was written by actual war veterans, was turned down because it kind of exposed a lot of nasty stuff that they went through.
Just to interject again, you use the term deny production. What they're denying is cooperation, access, and so you have to make a choice again whether you want to proceed without their assistance. And some projects have been scuttled because
there's hundreds of scripts that were just never produced because they couldn't get that assistance. But yeah, if a movie does get made, like they usually will go to Thailand or whatever, repaint some planes and, stuff like that. A fun one, because now we're getting into what we want to hear about, which is monster movies. A fun one that, got refused is Rampage. They requested assistance and they got turned down because they didn't like the amount of death that the monsters cause with the military, and they said, well, we want to keep that in, and so they ended up making it without that assistance, and that is something that's possible. Going to way back in the early days, like I said, this was made a normal thing after World War II, but there are examples of pre-World War II instances. King Kong had a situation where the studio RKO asked for some Navy Helldivers to be loaned out for the finale where they shoot Kong off of the buildings, and they were denied at first, and then they asked again by just calling the commanding officer that happened to be on duty that day, and he was like, yeah, sure. So he worked out a deal with them where they paid $100 to the officers' mess fund. They paid the pilots $10 each to fly around the Empire State Building for like a half hour, and in the Depression era, that was good money. And now we're going to go to Japan for a bit.
Why? Yeah, you might be asking yourselves, why are we talking about all of this stuff? Well, it really also has parallel roots in the history and the very origins of Godzilla, in the fact that the Japanese government during the 1930s and 40s basically took control of the Japanese film industry and turned it into a propaganda organ to generate enthusiasm for the war in China and later against the United States. And also to just generate enthusiasm and support for the troops overseas. And Eiji Tsuburaya, the effects genius that would eventually create Godzilla, he honed his craft in large part on some of these war movies that were being produced at Toho in the early 40s, because a great amount of money was poured into them, and he was able to create fantastic recreations in miniature of air and sea battles. And you may be familiar, a lot has been written over the years about this film, The War at Sea from Hawaii to Malaya, which Tsuburaya created an amazing reproduction of the attack on Pearl Harbor in miniature. Have any of you seen this or seen parts of the film? Yeah, I believe footage from it, if not the entire film, is still on YouTube. I haven't checked lately, but it was there for some time, so you might want to look there if it's not available elsewhere. And so this policy that was put into place during the war had tremendous effect on the content that was being produced at the time. But of course, when Japan lost the war and the American occupation was put in place, the Americans, of course, freed the Japanese film industry from this policy, but they put in place their own censorship policies after the war, which were equally constraining, but just in a different way. Of course, production of films in the immediate post-war period and during the occupation was greatly reduced because many of the people who had made them were, there's a lot going on with respect to the film industry, just the incapability of producing films on the same level, I'll put it that way. But the policies that were put in place by the occupation authorities were meant to, quote unquote, help democratize Japan. And there was a lot of emphasis put on things like women's rights, civil rights. Have you seen a film like No Regrets for Our Youth by Akira Kurosawa? That's an example of how the occupation pro-democratization policies were put into practice in film. But there was also a great deal of emphasis on not criticizing the United States and its role in the war, not making critical comments about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not really even referring them to them at all. And then, when the occupation authorities left Japan and these censorship policies were lifted, of course, you had this there was an immediate number of films that tackled the subject of the bomb, and that has a direct influence on the production of Godzilla, of course. But you also would begin to start to see war films be made again, but they would have a different perspective.
So tracing back the influence that this has on giant monster films, going back to Hollywood momentarily here. 1954 is the movie Them, with the giant ants. They requested assistance and were turned down because the premise was, giant ants, that's silly, it's unrealistic, things like that. They really didn't cooperate on science fiction, horror films back then. They really only worked on war films, things like that. So what happens between there and, the 70s is the draft ends. So they need to drive recruitment and things like that. And then that's when they start, one of the first movies they really start having oversight on is the 1976 King Kong. And, they had their demands for script changes, including some examples, removal of flamethrowers being used against Kong to avoid reminders of Vietnam. And then also a scene of National Guardsmen firing bazookas at looters was removed, which is hilarious. So then, now we get to Godzilla. The TriStar Godzilla, as some of you may know, was originally a different movie that was set to come out in 1994. Probably doesn't look too good on the screen here, but this is a copy of the letter that the studio wrote the Pentagon for a request for assistance. The movie didn't get made, so it's unknown how much oversight they would have had. But let's cut to the chase here and talk about Godzilla 98.
Oh, thank you. No, we do know that the interesting thing about this film, and I think we kind of touched on it already, it did have extensive support from the military, and which provided a lot of equipment, but you don't normally see this on lists of films that receive military cooperation, because in the end, the DoD was unhappy with the way that the military was portrayed on screen, and basically it's like an Alan Smithy film. They took their name off of it. But and you start to question why they would make that decision after the fact. Well, of course, in this film, the military both on purpose and accidentally destroys a number of New York landmarks, including here the Chrysler Building. They shoot at Godzilla and miss him, and instead they hit that building. They also destroy the Flatiron Building that way, which is a wonderful New York landmark. They destroy the Madison Square Garden. They destroy the Brooklyn Bridge, and so it doesn't look quite so good for our public relations. But at the same time, there's something in this film that I think is really interesting and sort of ingrained in our mythology, our popular mythology about the United States and the United States military, and that we're always fighting the good fight and doing the good thing. And so, you wouldn't expect, I guess, to see in an American Godzilla an impotent military in the way you do in the Japanese films, which have a different perspective altogether, and the Japanese military, of course, has a different posture altogether. So especially in the classic Godzilla films, you rarely, if ever, see a military solution. You might see something like you do in Gigantus or Godzilla Raids Again, where you see a sort of semi-military solution where you have these pilots who are not on duty, but they create a situation where the monster is not killed but defeated through a military-like action. But that tends to be fairly rare up until the more recent decades. But of course, in a Godzilla film made in the United States Air Force has to come to the rescue, and the monster is definitively killed by the U.S. military.
So, bringing us to Godzilla 2014, at first glance, you might not really think of that as a movie that has had a lot of this influence, because the military is largely ineffectual. Nothing they really do seems to work. It's not so much that bothers them. It's more, are they being portrayed heroically? Are they getting killed senselessly? That's the stuff that really bothers them. But we have a storyboard here of a scene where Godzilla was going to have a standoff with the military on Alcatraz Island, which was taken out. And then there's some more specific examples here too. The bomb itself had a lot of issues in getting rewrites and script notes for rewrites. We have the Muto taking the one nuke, and we have in the GIF here, it's giving it to its mate. In the original script, that was meant to be a U.S.-owned nuclear bomb, and as I mentioned in the showstopper segment, one of the things that that is a deal breaker for them is showing the U.S. losing control of a nuclear weapon. So it's just a tiny little piece of dialogue that you wouldn't even think anything about, but it was changed to being a Russian missile. The famous example, infamous example that sent Steve and I down this rabbit hole is this little piece. Everyone knows the great "let them fight," speech about this ancient rivalry between the monsters. Now, originally, that monologue from Serizawa was him telling, a sort of harrowing story about his father surviving the atomic bomb. And I'll just read the Pentagon script note here, page 99. Says, Serizawa recounts his father's recollection of the Hiroshima attack. If this is an apology or a questioning of the decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that will be a showstopper for us. So scene got rewritten, and "let them fight" is now like the iconic line that gave birth to that. It's one of those things where, all these years later, they're still very sensitive about, they want to uphold this idea that, the bombing was the right thing to do and things like that.
Now, isn't this also one of their objections was that it would be perceived as an apology for Hiroshima?
Yep.
And I find that fascinating because it's kind of an extension of United States, I don't know if policy is the right word, but a certain prevailing attitude coming out of Washington that seems to reflect also a prevailing attitude among the public that persists. I was reminded when we were reading about this of an incident that happened about 2 years after this, or about 2 years after the movie came out, when President Obama visited Hiroshima and gave a speech there.
The first president to do that, right?
Right, and there was a lot of consternation around this visit, particularly from the Republican Party, but really from all sides, that he was going there to issue an apology for Hiroshima, and the White House had to go out of its way to reassure the public and the press that no, this wasn't an apology. So this is a reflection of, even in the film, of this prevailing attitude, again, that, whatever we do militarily and during times of war, we're doing the right thing, and we must never apologize for that and take a position of weakness.
Yeah. And then we're going to talk about the portrayal of servicemen for a moment. Our hero, Ford Brody, I think no matter what side of the fence, whether you like this movie a lot or dislike this movie a lot, it seems like everyone can kind of agree that this isn't the most interesting protagonist. As written, the character had a little bit more duality and a little bit more to him. There were scenes that showed his stressful relationship with his wife. Things weren't all perfect. He would lie to get himself out of situations, which was seen as him neglecting his duty as a serviceman and things like that. And so I even have a quote right here from Phil Strubb, who's the Pentagon's go-to guy with these productions, and he said, he read the script and he just didn't like this character. He called him a loathsome creature. He said he was a liar and a manipulator, and he didn't like that him and his wife were having, marital issues. And he asked, what's up with this negative character? And he said, can you strip all that out? And so that's why he's kind of this stoic sort of G.I. Joe type, instead of, having an actual character arc, because character arcs aren't allowed, I guess. So now what's interesting is when we go to Godzilla King of the Monsters, this is a film that made a request for Pentagon assistance and was turned down, and I don't think we know the exact reasons, but if I had to guess, I would say, while it has a sort of, it treats the nuclear bomb sort of lightly, I would have to think, it wasn't military personnel that deliver and detonate the bomb. And then also, the scene of Rodan and the pilots where the guy ejects into Rodan's mouth and gets eaten. I can imagine those were big deal breakers. But it is a little interesting that a movie without being told to portray the bomb a certain way made the decision to do it, right?
There's also kind of a cavalier or reckless attitude to the way the military behaves in this film and the way it's portrayed. I think the whole incident with the Osprey, the way they're handling that is kind of, more like something from the Fast and the Furious. And there's also the sort of casual way the oxygen destroyer is deployed. Oh yeah, by the way, you might want to get out of there. We're going to blow everything up in about 10 minutes.
Yeah, well, like you said, I think another thing, with the military having to win and everything, I think the nuclear bomb being sort of not a big deal, I think, is one of those things that's ingrained in our psyches as Americans.
There's something, I meant to bring this up on a previous slide, but I'll try to bring it up here. There's a quote, the documentary that inspired this panel and our thinking about this is largely put together by a gentleman named Matt Alford. And Matt Alford, and it's based on his research. Matt Alford is a scholar from the UK who's been kind of barraging the Department of Defense and the United States government with Freedom of Information Act requests to kind of bring up some of this documentation for a number of years. And he has a book called National Security Cinema, which came out a few years ago. And he has a quote that I think it relates to both this film and the 2014 film really well. He said, quote, the national security, he refers to this type of film and this type of involvement as national security cinema. I'm sorry, national security entertainment. He said, national security entertainment promotes violent, self-regarding, American-centric solutions to national problems based on twisted readings of history. And
if ever there were films that did that, I think, well, particularly the 2014 film, I think that was one of my, and I don't hate that film, I actually enjoy parts of it very much, but that opening sequence where the Castle Bravo explosion at the Bikini is kind of repurposed to be in this version of history, a Godzilla extermination project. I find that extremely offensive to the origins of Godzilla and the reasons why Godzilla exists. I think that's a very strange way for the Hollywood, and of course they can do whatever they want. They bought the rights to the character and it was approved by Toho, but I think that's a very strange way to reinterpret the origins of the character. And of course in this film, the 2019 film, you have that sort of underground or undersea bunker, is that the...
Yeah, in 2019, the cool tech, like, here's where all our gadgets are, underground base called Castle Bravo. And the Castle Bravo tests, like, you know, they harmed a lot of people. I mean, some people consider that like a third atomic bombing, basically. You know, there was a lot of casualties, and it was an atrocity, really. But American movies will make it into a cute little Easter egg, you know? And yeah, the 2014 Godzilla, one of my things is always at the end, like, that nuke goes off in like a populated area, you know, it's driven like 60 feet out into the ocean, and it blows up and no one says anything. We ready to talk about Japan?
A little bit about Japan. And it's interesting, it's very difficult to research this subject matter, and for a variety of reasons that we can't get into in detail, but so it's really, I think, heroic on the part of these UK researchers to have uncovered the amount of information that they're doing. In Japan, there's even less public information about the SDF's historic involvement in the film industry. But we do know, of course, that the SDF was created by the Defense Act, and it actually officially became the Self-Defense Force in July of 1954, interestingly, at the time that Godzilla went into production. We do know a bit about, well, first of all, I would say that one of the reasons it's interesting to look at this stuff, too, from a historic perspective is, at the present day, there's concern in Japan, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about this later, that the SDF is currently having more influence over film and television in Japan in ways that are getting dangerously close or similar to the way that the government and the military influenced film production in the 1940s and 30s. We do know, of course, that at the time that Godzilla went into production, the script for the original Godzilla was submitted to ERIN, which is I guess the rough equivalent in Japan of the MPAA, for review as per the guidelines there. And that happened just as the film was going into production, and the film was approved for production, but with a note attached to it from the government, which is this government, quasi-government agency, which was told the producers of the film, let's see if I can find the exact quote, it stated that the self-defense forces shall be treated with the utmost care and respect by the production side. Now that's kind of vague, but it's really basically a warning not to portray the military in a negative light. There's also strong evidence that the SDF did cooperate. We know, based on testimony or anecdotal information from Honda and other people on the production side, that the SDF actually provided the soldiers in the film that are seen firing at Godzilla as it comes ashore. Those are actual pieces of footage that were taken at a military facility when these folks were taking target practice. Also, there's the convoy of military vehicles that you can see during the big rollout sequence. Those are actual SDF military vehicles and tanks, but they weren't given special accommodations to film these vehicles. What they actually had to do, this is the Toho filming crew, was actually go to Utsunomiya, which is a place north of Tokyo, and film this convoy that was actually being transferred from Utsunomiya to Chiba, which is a base closer to Tokyo. And apparently what they were doing was, parking themselves with their vehicles, setting up their cameras and equipment, shooting footage as the vehicles were rolling down the road, and then once the vehicles were passed, they would have to load everything up, drive further down the road, I guess at a speed at which they could pass the vehicles up, set themselves up further down the road, take some more footage, and they did this a number of times until they had enough footage to get what they needed. It's not clear, though, whether the film received any specific guidelines. We just don't have documentation as to whether any specific restrictions were placed on the filmmakers by the SDF. One thing, though, that's interesting about the first Godzilla is that we also see this documentary-style footage, particularly of the depth charges being discharged deployed in Tokyo Bay. That's really interesting stuff because it provides, first of all, a level of authenticity that you don't normally see in this film. There's just no clear documentation, though, as to where or how that was obtained. Clearly, it was done with government approval, but it may also, the origin of the footage may come from archives that Toho may have had, going back to the war days. We just don't have specific information about the footage's origins, but clearly it's of a wartime vintage. You can just tell from the grain and the type of damage and wear on the footage itself. Much of the information that we do have about the SDF's involvement in the Showa films comes from quotations from Ishiro Honda himself. Unfortunately, he wasn't asked a lot of detailed questions in interviews about this matter, but he did talk about it from time to time. Particularly, there's some interesting anecdotes he provided about the involvement of the SDF in films from about the time of the Mysterians in 1957, and how that involvement evolved and basically decreased over a period of time up until the War of the Gargantuas in 1966. So I have a quote here from him that I'll read that I think is kind of interesting about this. He said, quote, for the self-defense force scenes in Chikubo, again, the Mysterians, there was an army officer training school in Gotenba, the Fuji school. Gotenba is, of course, located next to or near Mount Fuji. We asked permission to film whenever they were practicing outdoors with ammunition. So we got their schedule and found what time and where they would practice. We'd go in advance and set up the cameras. And then when they would come and practice, we'd film them that way. I think there were about 600 military people who cooperated us. This is for the Mysterians. Back then, whenever we asked the SDF department and the government, they'd give us permission. But at one point in the National Assembly, they started discussing whether the SDF should be cooperating with a private company, a private movie studio. So after that, we couldn't get the real SDF soldiers, footage of the real SDF soldiers and equipment any longer. By the time that we were filming Sanda Taigaira, which is War of the Gargantuas, the SDF scenes were all done with extras, but still, at that time, there were still some people who had experience from the war and in the military, so it was better than now. These days, we have to train people just to stand up straight properly. So this was a quote from around the time that Honda was working with Akira Kurosawa on films like Akira Kurosawa's Dreams, and if you've seen that, you remember that there was a scene with World War II soldiers being repatriated.
Yeah, Honda was making sure they were walking in the right formation.
Honda, being a veteran, of course, being one of the principal members of the crew, was in charge of training them to walk properly. He was frustrated that they had no prior experience.
All right, so now we get into the Heisei era, and things get a little wonkier because at first they're very cooperative. They work on Biollante a lot, and King Ghidorah. And then we found this interview with Shusuke Kaneko, who wanted to direct Godzilla vs. Mothra, but he was talking about how GMK did not have any JSDF assistance. And he had mentioned that in Godzilla vs. Mothra, there was a line or something where, like, the little girl questions, like, why are they shooting at the good monster, Mothra? And they didn't like that. So after that, they stopped cooperating. And then we go to the Heisei era, or Mechagodzilla. Shogo Tomiyama, the producer, has a little bit of a different story there, where he says, it was difficult to cooperate because of just the concept of Mechagodzilla, a fictional combat weapon, and he wanted to be able to do whatever he wanted with the idea of Mechagodzilla, and so that's where they start using G-Force instead of the JSDF. So I guess there's two different stories here, maybe a little column A, a little column B, pick your poison. But I know that they did come back and aid Destroya a little bit. But Gamera, let's talk about Gamera.
I think, it's really interesting here because there's a shift in the way the SDF is portrayed in these films. And you can really see it in Shin Godzilla, of course, today. But that shift started with Gamera, and Gamera 2 in particular. And it really goes back to, I think, to the influence of Shusuke Kaneko, the director that we're talking about. Shusuke Kaneko is really, if you listen to his interviews and listen to him talk, he puts a lot of importance on the preservation of the post-war Japanese constitution. And he's really dead set against the push in recent times to amend the post-war constitution to enable the Japanese military to move from a purely defensive posture and have a more proactive military and get involved more in international conflicts, as there's been pressure on Japan to do. He feels that Article 9 in the Defense Act are the safeguards against a return to imperialism, and they're put in place to preserve Japanese democracy. And so his portrayal of the military and the way it's deployed on film is really reflective of that. And I think his portrayal of the military in these films has had an influence gradually on the way the military is deployed, or at least the way the conversation around the military and the way it's deployed has kind of evolved in the last couple of decades. And I want to read another quote, and this is from Kaneko, and he's talking about his philosophy or his approach to the military, starting with Gamera 2, although I think there's some evidence of this in his first Gamera film as well.
Yeah, it was all three, but the second one is the most.
Right, and the military is central to the Gamera 2, Attack of Legion. And this quote comes from an interview that he did with us as part of Kaiju Masterclass in 2020, which was an online convention that we put together, as we said, during COVID. Quote, he says, "What would really happen if a monster actually appeared in the world? In the Japanese constitution, the SDF has the right to act in defense only. Therefore, unless the monster attacks first, the SDF has no right to attack monsters automatically. Not to mention the issues with firing weapons in urban areas. All those issues created a more suppressed SDF, as you could see in Gamera 1, but it's also created some incidents that were unfortunate. He uses the word unfortunate, such as the SDF destroying Tokyo Tower. Gamera 2 became the one and only, or the first movie to show the Japanese military battling within the Japanese homeland against invaders, monster invaders. The battlegrounds of the Imperial Japanese military were always in foreign lands or on foreign soil, foreign seas. They never fought to protect the Japanese land or its people. Then Japan lost the war and the casualties were unspeakable. And the Japanese constitution enacted after the war was based on regret from this experience, and it promised the abandonment of war. It's a valuable treasure for us. Again, his attitude about the constitution. So through Gamera 2, I was able to create the first film in which the SDF truly fought to protect Japan. It was the type of SDF which protects the Constitution. I was very proud of it. I didn't mean to comment about the Liberal Democratic Party's proposal to expand the SDF's role in my movie, but Prime Minister Abe, referring to the late former Prime Minister Abe, he tried to destroy our Constitution and should not be forgiven. The Emperor wanted to keep our Constitution intact, but the Prime Minister is trying to destroy our democracy. Well, how do you really feel, Mr. Kaneko? And I wanted to showcase the work of Professor Noriko Sudo. We mentioned that it's very hard to research this topic in the United States and how the Department of Defense is influencing Hollywood. Well, there's even less material about this in Japan, in the way the Japanese Defense Ministry is influencing the Japanese film and television industries. But there's one champion of this kind of information, and she's written a book in Japanese, and we're going to try to see if we can glean some information out of it through translation. That's Professor Noriko Suda, and this quote, we were corresponding with her, and this is a comment she made, and it kind of reinforces what Kaneko says. After Gamma 2, from the mid-1990s forward, films featuring the JSDF began to represent their sorties and attacks in accordance with the guidelines of the Defense Act in Article 9, even though these films are fiction. If you think back to the way the film, the military, the SDF is portrayed in the Honda films, there's really no thought to this. The SDF just kind of rolls out. There's no discussion as to whether and when it should be deployed. She says, in Shin Godzilla, the scenes showing discussions between the politicians about this were quite long, parentheses, boring for me, but it became a main theme of films depicting the SDF. So it's kind of interesting, and we look forward to learning more about her work.
With the Millennium Films, there's not too much to say. They cooperated on 2000 and the two Mechagodzillas, so if Tomiyama's version of why they stopped cooperating in the 90s is true, either they changed their mind about Mechagodzilla or he's just lying, but so they weren't involved with Megaguirus, GMK, or Final Wars. But enough about that. Now let's get into some more interesting stuff here. The Reiwa era with Shin Godzilla.
Yep. So yeah, there's a lot of things that separate Shin Godzilla from the rest of the entire franchise, but I think that it's notable, whether you like the film or not, to point out that it's an attempt, to depict so many things in a more realistic fashion. Since something like 1954, Japan itself, the bureaucracy, the cities, the photography of the landscapes, everything, and even the way the monster is portrayed. It's an attempt to do something in a more straightforward fashion. And as part of that, the military, we see the equipment showcased in ways that we haven't seen before. We have, as helicopters and other pieces of equipment are introduced on screen, we see, the identifiers, which is something you don't normally see. It's all, part of a new or sort of approach to this type of material. And there's a very, as part and parcel of this more, I'd say, heroic depiction of the military, there's a great deal of SDF cooperation with this film. You see a great deal of equipment and personnel on screen. You see a more realistic, I think, depiction of something like the command center that's triage, that's set up. When I was watching the film, I think back to something like Godzilla versus Gigan, where the command center out in the field is basically a lean-to with one guy and a radio. It's a complete turnaround, but there's a lot of different reasons for that. And this film just overall reflects a more positive attitude toward the military, and I think part of that is a reflection of the triple disaster of 3/11 in 2011, the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown, and the way the military responded to it. They were largely perceived as heroes in the aftermath of that disaster because of the way they responded to the meltdown and the evacuation. They largely, had a strong presence and role in the evacuation of people from the danger zones, and also in the cooling of the reactors, whereas the Japanese bureaucracy was perceived as, stalling and having a really ineffective and ineffectual response. And also, of course, TEPCO, the company that ran the power company, was in bed with the government. So all of that is reflected in the movie itself, which uses the monster as sort of an analogy for 3/11. There really hasn't been a public accounting of the number of the pieces of equipment and the type of cooperation, the level of cooperation between the military and the producers of the film. But we do know from Toho's own booklet that was published with the release of the film that director Hideaki Anno actually went to the Ministry of Defense and have interviewed people there to try to gain cooperation and also information to help with the authenticity of the way the military is deployed, and also the rank and file, the way they're portrayed, and also dialogue and terminology. Just before the release of Shin Godzilla, the Ministry of Defense issued a statement in which they said, quote, Shin Godzilla is a typical example of the cooperation of the Ministry of Defense and the JSDF in the production of films. In other words, we really like the way we're portrayed in this movie. So it's interesting. Yeah, if Top Gun was issued, getting into the material on this slide, Top Gun, as Kyle mentioned, was kind of a way for the Department of Defense to get involved in a film to help rehabilitate the military's reputation after Vietnam, which was a real black eye on the military. Shin Godzilla and films like it are helpful in recruitment of the Japanese self-defense forces, which have had a hard time over the years, really owing to the fact that Japan's is a pacifist, or perceived as a pacifist country, and so there's not a lot of people who grow up wanting to go into the military and fight overseas. And so one of the things that they've used over the last couple of decades to generate enthusiasm, particularly among young men, is to incorporate both real and fictional or sort of made-up anime characters in their advertising. And when Shin Godzilla came out, they did the same thing with the monster by showcasing Godzilla in their recruitment advertising. We actually translated some of the text from one of the posters here.
Yeah, so you see, the positions they're trying to recruit for, and there's their slogans, protect the present and the future, and things like that. And like Steve said, the anime has become a huge platform for kind of recruitment propaganda. We have that little poster there, and in fact, right after Shin Godzilla, Shinji Higuchi directed an anime series called Dragon Pilot, which is on Netflix, and that's more or less about these young girls that enlist in the Air Force, and they find these dragons hidden in the basement to go and fight. And it's that was very heavily done as a production with the JSDF. Shinzo Abe said that he felt that the film's popularity was rooted in unwavering support that the public has for the military. Yeah.
I just wanted to briefly, there are very few places, just going back, there's Godzilla tourism in Japan, and it's greatly increased apparently since Shin Godzilla. People are traveling all over to look at the sites where Godzilla appeared. Of course, Godzilla tourism, I guess, is nothing new. The G tours that G-Fan organized some time ago were part of that, but it's greatly increased in recent years. And people are traveling around the country there are air shows that are promoted where you can go and look at some of the hardware that was showcased in the movie. And the military is sort of embracing its connection to Godzilla in ways that it hadn't in the past. There are very few public museums where you can go and look at tanks and helicopters and things like that. But this is a display at a place called Rikunland in Camp Asaka, which is outside of Tokyo. These, of course, are models, but they set up this diorama in the museum where they're recreating a scene, or a facsimile of a scene from the movie, which I think is quite interesting. There is increasing documentation of the SDF's involvement in films dating back into the 1980s, and both in live-action productions and anime productions, interestingly. And they tend to really favor period pieces and other ways in which historical events are recreated, and ways in which they can influence the story in much the same ways that the Department of Defense does in Hollywood. And here are two examples, which is the first on the right is Samurai Commando Mission 1549, which many of you may have seen. It's a time slip movie with the SDF going back to feudal times, which was directed by Tezuka, interestingly enough. And Isoroku is a biopic of Admiral Yamamoto, of course.
So another one that had a whole lot of partnership was Shin Ultraman. On the right is the cover of a military magazine that came out. It's for like artillery nerds, but in that magazine is a whole, you can find the link, it's in Japanese online, but to the article, but it's like basically a catalog of each and every piece of military equipment showcased in Shin Ultraman and what it is, how big it is, and stuff like that. And then we spent a lot of time talking about American and Japanese examples because that's where most of it relating to our interests are. But some examples outside of the USA, Reptilicus, going back to the 60s, the guy that ran Saga Studios who made the film. He had ties to the majority political party, and he was able to pull strings and get a lot of military assistance. That's why, as cheap and derpy as that movie is, all the military stuff looks really good, and there's not a whole lot of stock footage. Skull Island was a co-production between Legendary and Tencent Pictures in China, and they had filmed in Vietnam, and they had a lot of Vietnamese government and military support, which is probably why it was able to get away with some of the more critical aspects of American involvement in Vietnam. And then the recent Netflix film Troll had a lot of Norwegian military support. And yeah, I mean, this is just like the tip of the iceberg. There's so many resources that people can check out.
If you're interested in learning more, as we hope you are, and thank you all for coming and staying with us the whole time. And first and foremost, if you go to the Kaiju Masterclass YouTube page, or if you just look up, if you can't find it, go to kaijumasterclass.com. And we are just now posting, I think today, a new interview that Kyle and I did with Matt Alford, who's one of the producers of this documentary that you see on the far left called Theaters of War, which is highly recommended. It's really fascinating. It does include some material about Godzilla, but it's a complete overview. We're just touching the surface here, and it really gets into the difficulty that the researchers have had uncovering this film because of the fact that the DoD has really maintained it's hiding in plain sight, but they're really maintained a really strict and effective control over how this information is even released to the public about what they're doing. There's also the two books by Matt Alford, Real Power, and especially National Security Cinema, they're both great. I'm reading National Security Cinema now, and it's fascinating. And the Spy Culture website. Spyculture.com
is a website. Another guy in the UK, Tom Secker, who works with Matt Alford and was also involved with that documentary. But that's a good place to go for updates. And I mean, you can look up like PDFs, hundreds of pages of documents on all kinds of different films on there. So check out all that stuff. And thank you all.
Thanks for coming.
We did it. 3 minutes to spare.
All right.